Much has been made about Hamas being a genocidal antisemitic terrorist organization, and rightfully so. Its publicly available charter is more than explicit about its genocidal antisemitic aims, and we would all be wise to take Hamas at its word. Shrugging off these aspects of Hamas does not make them any less murderous or any more make-believe. But there is a second side to Hamas and other terrorist organizations, both past and present, that gets less attention, yet is likely the oxygen which allows for its genocidal, anti-Semitic terrorism to remain alive and kicking. Hamas is ultimately a business. Like you and I go to work every day, those who work for Hamas Incorporated, or Hamas Limited, do the same. And like any business has multiple departments, so does Hamas. Hence why Hamas's leaders are billionaires, and some 1,700 of its operatives have become millionaires, despite having no access to crude oil, other lucrative natural resources, or an international economy in the Gaza Strip. How is this the case? One word: terrorism. This is Hamas's core product, but certainly not its only one. While the term Palestinian goes back to the 1800s, the actual Palestinian people is a rather novel concept that began in the 1960s. The Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, was founded in 1964 in Egypt, the same place where the Muslim Brotherhood came to life. Hamas is, of course, an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood and shares its same ideology. Among the PLO's first order of operations was terrorism against Israel, supported by the Soviets, their most enduring success against the quote-unquote free world, according to Major General Ion Mihai Pacepa, the highest-ranking Soviet defector during the Cold War. Pacepa wrote that, for nearly 4 decades, the PLO was the largest, wealthiest, and most politically connected terrorist organization in the world. It used drug trafficking, arms smuggling, money laundering, and counterfeiting to amass a fortune estimated to be $10 billion by the early 1990s, nearly $25 billion if adjusted for inflation today. The PLO collaborated with international criminal organizations, drug cartels, other terror groups, and rogue states such as Libya, Iran, Iraq, North Korea, and Sudan. Yasser Arafat, who became chairman of the PLO in 1969, was notoriously corrupt, using public funds for his own purposes, which ranged from financing an expensive lifestyle in Paris for his wife, to buying and retaining the support of Palestinian politicians, to funding 13 so-called security organizations, which Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon used to call security terror organizations. Then, in the 1990s, when the Israelis and Palestinians signed 2 peace accords in Oslo and the Palestinians were supposed to quote-unquote grow up, Palestinian corruption did not subside. It intensified. Here is how Hassan Krisha, the deputy speaker of the Palestinian Legislative Council, put it, quote, "Since the signing of the Oslo Accords, we have had 12 Palestinian governments. Each government has at least 24 ministers. This means we have had 228 ministers, in addition to advisors. All receive high salaries and luxurious vehicles." End quote. During the 1990s, U.S. President Bill Clinton's administration invited Arafat to the White House 13 times, more times than any other foreign visitor. And you can be sure that among the many possible subjects being discussed, his personal corruption did not appear on the list, according to Elliot Abrams, a senior fellow for the Middle Eastern Studies Council on Foreign Relations. That was a very damaging position for our country to take, for it just encouraged even more corruption, Abrams added. It signaled to Palestinians who were disgusted with public corruption that we were not interested and were not going to hold Arafat to account. The international community's refusal or incompetence in not holding Arafat accountable for nepotism and corruption drove Palestinians in Gaza into the open arms of Hamas, the terror group which promised them reform. But for the average Palestinian in Gaza, the situation is economically far worse than in the West Bank, so one would think that Hamas would have to build strong social systems to support their constituents when it violently came to governing power there in 2007. Instead, the terror group took lessons from the Palestinian Authority's kleptocracy and doubled down on them, using terrorism against Israel and its own people as the impetus. Social services, which are laboriously difficult and cost-intensive, can make or break a government, especially one that does not have enough tax revenue to foot the bill. After all, some reports suggest half of Gaza's population is unemployed, and per capita, GDP is around $5,600, making it one of the poorest places in the world. So what did Hamas do? It hijacked international organizations, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in Gaza, overinflated their budgetary needs, and even put many of its own operatives on the agency's payroll, as well as in positions of power and influence. Today, this organization, which remains the world's only refugee agency dedicated to a specific population, has an annual operating budget of more than $1 billion because, in 1982, it began changing the definition of a Palestinian refugee and expanded it to include every generation of descendants. In other words, even the great-grandchild of a refugee is also considered a refugee and can therefore receive benefits from the UN agency, such as healthcare, education, welfare, microloans, and refugee camp infrastructure improvement. Thus, this UN agency does one of the most vital jobs for Hamas, all with international aid, which allows the Palestinian faction to focus its finances on doing what it does best: terrorism. Estimates of Hamas's annual military budget, its terrorism budget really, range from $100 million to $350 million, including major financing from Iran. Much has been reported about Hamas's vast network of terror tunnels, but what seldom hits the headlines is how Hamas monetizes them. In addition to terror activity and infrastructure, Hamas uses these tunnels to smuggle Egyptian goods from Gaza's southern border, which generate multiple millions of dollars per month. And senior Hamas figures levy taxes on all of the trade and other activities passing through the tunnels, for a combined income of up to $450 million per year. Meanwhile, the everyday Palestinian in Gaza is heavily dependent on foreign aid, with Qatar topping the list of donors. The Gulf monarchy is estimated to have contributed over $1.5 billion during the past decade, although the money has mainly been disbursed as stipends for public officials and poor families, not to develop the economy. Experts and Western governments question whether Hamas commingles funds for its military and other operations, but Hamas representatives have said that the group strictly separates funding for the administration of Gaza from funding for its military wing. I will let you decide which side you want to believe. Meanwhile, mosques are used by Hamas as warehouses to stash money, weapons, and equipment. Large, wrapped-up prayer rugs are donated to mosques, except only so-called special volunteers are allowed to open them or transport the rugs in and out. Big boxes are marked as food aid, but, quote, there wasn't food inside, just something made of iron, according to Ala Mohammed Mushtaha, whose family has lived in Gaza for generations. To add insult to injury, Hamas does not return the favor. It uses and loses hundreds of Palestinian children each year digging its tunnels. In addition to taking a big cut of all the goods entering Gaza, Hamas limits their flow to keep the population angry and dependent. And sometimes, to make a point, Hamas blows up the pipes that bring fuel into Gaza and bombs the border crossings through which aid and aid workers pass. Yet despite all of the misery Hamas has inflicted on the population of Gaza, it has, quote, remained exceedingly popular among the people, according to Michael Oren, a former Israeli ambassador to the United States. This is because Hamas, as well as the Palestinian Authority, which runs the Palestinian West Bank, has composed a popular, persuasive, and pervasive narrative. Despite or in spite of such mind-boggling corruption, the Palestinians' problems are predominantly Israel's fault. Just as there is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there is the Palestinian hierarchy of hate. Many Palestinians know that Hamas and the Palestinian Authority purposely deprive their constituents, but Israel remains at the pinnacle of everything that is abhorrent about the world. If only the Jewish state did not exist, the Palestinians would have a life full of opportunity, prosperity, and everything that is good in the world. However, a couple of years ago, perhaps sensing its support slipping in the Strip, Hamas decided to engage with Israel on a deal that ultimately allowed 18,000 Palestinians in Gaza to cross into Israel and the West Bank and work in sectors like agriculture or construction, which typically carry salaries up to 10 times what a worker could earn in Gaza. Of course, Hamas was not simply operating from the so-called kindness of its heart. It saw another revenue opportunity. One Palestinian woman from Gaza, who worked as a housekeeper in Israel, said Hamas took 75% of the wages she earned. Abroad, the Palestinians work their economic exploits as well. They have lobbyists like many other groups, but they have something even more effective: unofficial lobbyists. Throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and much of the West, Palestinian propaganda is plentiful, attractive, and intoxicating. Influencers and content creators flood social media with pro-Palestinian content, which outnumbers pro-Israel content 36-1 on TikTok, according to one statistician. College students and activists organize bombastic marches on campuses and in Western capitals. Gullible academics, reporters, and media personalities disseminate empty cliches and nuanceless narratives that make much of their audiences sympathize with the so-called uninvolved and poor Palestinians. By having so many influential folks promote the Palestinian cause around the world, Palestinian leaders accomplish two game changers. First, they extract money from the West, a tactic that plays on the guilt of Western elites and politicians who inaccurately see the Palestinians as a colored group of people at the mercy of white colonial settler Zionists. After all, Western elites and politicians do not hold accountable those who commit crimes that they blame themselves for. Palestinian leadership, perfectly understanding this cunning psychology, continues to use Israel, again so-called white colonial settler Zionists, as a scapegoat for all their people's troubles, which means the Palestinians do not need to use the money they pocket from Western sources to develop institutions that would in turn lead to a state. Think about it. Running a state requires hard work to make things function every day, and it would tremendously limit the personal ambitions of these Palestinian leaders. Since the world is willing to pay the Palestinians for whatever they seem to need, there is no good financial incentive to give up the forever state of victimhood if you are among Palestinian leadership. Although the US and the European Union have designated Hamas as a terrorist organization, quote, "They're not effectively cut off from the international financial system," said Hans Jakob Schindler, senior director of the Counter-Extremism Project. They actually are able to invest funds in companies and in real estate. And boy does Hamas invest. It has owned Sudanese companies that dealt in mining, chicken farming, and road construction, 2 skyscrapers in the United Arab Emirates, and other property-related business ventures in Algeria and Turkey. In 2015, Israeli intelligence officials found what they termed Hamas's secret investment portfolio, totaling some $500 million. The second game changer for Palestinians is the war of information, a war on reality, really, the only arena in which they can come close to defeating, that is, delegitimizing, the Jewish state. By waging this war of information, a war the Palestinians know Israel cannot win, the so-called international community allows Israel to fight the Palestinians to a draw, but rarely to a victory, which is one reason why the wars keep occurring, according to British writer Douglas Murray. For Palestinian leadership, both in Gaza and the West Bank, this is precisely in accordance with their economic playbook. The game plan looks something like this. Palestinian terrorists brutally attack Israel to force a significant military response from the Israeli government, which translates into mass misery for the Palestinian civilian population, captured by a news media eager to disseminate this agony far and wide. Suddenly, every Palestinian is a journalist, woman, or child. Nobody belongs to any terror group. Even if they are Hamas or the Palestinian Authority, they somehow become an underage female journalist when they're killed. Ha ha ha. In turn, Palestinian leaders use these innocent deaths and mass misery to generate new recruits, propaganda, and support, both diplomatic and financial, from allies in the region and across the world. The West, easily fooled by the news media and social media, encourages their countries and humanitarian organizations to continue funneling billions of dollars to the Palestinian territories, thereby giving Hamas and the Palestinian Authority a very literal free pass from spending its money on socio-economic initiatives for the everyday Palestinian. This means more money for terrorism and other illegal activities, and the process repeats itself, taking on a lethal flywheel whose momentum will be harder to stop with every round of violence, irrespective of the circumstances. Palestinian leaders and politicians preach all things Islam, Allah, jihad, and martyrdom, but they are not as impressionable as some of their supporters. They themselves do not engage in terrorism, and they surely wouldn't blow themselves up, go on a shooting spree, or infiltrate Israel on a death conquest in the name of their genocidal, fascist, Islamic fundamentalist ideology. Some of them don't even live up to the religion to which they profess submission. According to a report on the Saudi news website Elaf, the sons of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh drink alcohol, which is forbidden by Islam, and spend time with women other than their wives in luxury nightclubs. Ironically, though, Hamas has put enormous pressure on imams since its current war with Israel started to persuade Gaza's population that their only choice is the resistance, Hamas, in plain diction. And since schools and universities aren't functioning, the one thing that draws people in is prayer. As Ala Mohammed Mushtaha described it, quote, Hamas exploits our religion, pretending to be modern-day prophets, likening themselves to the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, meaning Hamas, and only Hamas is the only way to alleviate our suffering. We're all paying the price.